Okay, welcome and hello everyone. My name is Mary Kate and I'm an AmeriCorps member with Conservation Nebraska. Welcome to the Wildlife Photography Ethics and Tips webinar. Before we start, I just want to let everyone know that you are muted and you cannot be seen. If you have any questions, please type them in chat. We'll either get to them during the webinar or we will go ahead and address any leftover or extra ones at the end of the talk. So with all that being said, this evening we are joined by self-made wildlife photographer Alex Wiles. He is a remarkable photographer who has many stunning photographs from around the world, including here in Nebraska. He's been working on several projects. He is very knowledgeable, and I'm very glad he was able to take this time to speak with us this evening. Hi, Alex.
Hey, everybody. So thanks for the introduction, Mary Kate. Self-made wildlife photographer sounds funny because every wildlife photographer I know kind of has to figure it out and, just make it work and all that stuff. So, I mean, yeah, it's applicable self-made, but I think most people are self-made. So it's one of those things you kind of got to hustle to make it work. But thanks for having me here. I was asked to talk a little bit about my personal experiences and my personal background with wildlife photography, give a little bit of an example of some of the stuff I've been working on, and then more specifically, give some tips and tricks and talk a little bit about the ethics of wildlife photography as well. It's something that a lot of people tend to glance over, when they're looking at wildlife photography and they see these beautiful pictures, but there's a lot that goes into those beautiful pictures. Most of it amazing and positive, but sometimes if you don't know what you're looking for, there's also some negative things that can be associated with it as well from a conservation standpoint. So yeah, I'll touch on a few of those different subjects. I'm very freeform with a lot of my presentations. So please feel free to ask questions in the comments box. I know Mary Kate is going to be moderating a little bit and may interject here and there with any of the questions that you guys may have, if it's relevant to the specific topic I'm talking about at that point in time. Otherwise, I will try to leave some time at the end for specific questions you guys may have, anything that you may want to ask me. I'm probably going to breeze through this pretty quickly, to be honest, because there's only so much that a picture can stay on a screen before people get bored with it. And I do have some videos interjected into here as well, because most of what I've been doing recently has actually been video based, not just still photography based. So with that being said, hopefully Zoom cooperates today and we get some decent resolution and not too glitchy video. If that is the case, please feel free to let me know. And I'm happy to just give you a verbal description if that's the case. But yeah, so without further ado, let's see if I can get my screen share figured out. Let's see. Okay, so we got this. Let's see. Is everyone getting, let's see if it will let me click play. You're not gonna let me, are you? There we go. All right, can everybody see the opening title screen? Mary Kate, are we good with that?
Yep, you look good.
Awesome. So, well, the picture looks good. I don't look good. I've been sweating, moving all day. So yeah, so I'm going to basically start off with just naming it a generic wildlife photography, because there's a lot of topics that we're going to be going over today and that I'm going to be kind of broaching a lot of different subjects with you. But more specifically, it's wildlife photography and a personal account of winging it and the basics of ethics. So like I said earlier, wildlife photography, it's not an exact science. It's not, I mean, there are some degree programs out there specifically for photography. There's some more recent things with conservation and wildlife photography that you can get involved in, but honestly, a lot of it is winging it and just figuring it out as you go along. There's no specific roadmaps for a single person. Everyone has their own specific niches and their specific specialties. I'm a little bit of a generalist, but there are a few things that I've been specializing in recently. So yeah, so just know that everything that you're seeing here, it's not an exact roadmap. It could be entirely different for you if that's something that you're interested in doing in the long run. I'm happy to, answer any questions you may have that are relevant to my experiences, but yeah, you kind of got to just get out there and do it. So to begin with, I'm going to give you a general introduction of who I am and my background to give you an idea of how my roadmap worked with the whole wildlife photography thing. I am a full-time multimedia producer right now, so I do a lot of freelance stuff working for different nonprofits, international NGOs, Things like I just finished up the National Geographic piece that I was actually, it was more of a commercial piece that I was hired on for. And so, yeah, that's what I do full time. And it didn't start out that way though. So this is my introduction, the interesting parts at least, right? You don't want to hear about the day-to-day mundane stuff. So I was actually started off my professional career as a zookeeper. I had some odd jobs here and there, you know, installing solar panels. I was a dog groomer for a while. Believe it or not, I'm actually a certified massage therapist. I went to school for that at one point right out of high school. But my main career started off as a zookeeper. And so I was a zookeeper for the better part of a decade. And that's what actually brought me out to here to Omaha, Nebraska, where I currently live. I used to live in Fresno, California, and now I live in Omaha, and what brought me here was a job at the Henry Dorley Zoo. Here I am taking care of one of the Komodo dragons that used to be there. I don't believe he's around there anymore. But after a while of almost a decade of doing a lot of zookeeping work, I actually started to do a little bit more field biology work too in the field of conservation. This one was specifically Wyoming toads out in Laramie, which is a functionally extinct species. So I got to get out and do a lot of really cool field research. And one of the most, I guess, pivotal moments for me transitioning into wildlife photography was on a trip to Galapagos. And you can actually see Mary Kate right there in the bottom, almost closest to the right there. So we actually went on a study abroad trip to Galapagos while I was still studying in college. And so while I was there, I actually took a few pretty decent pictures with my camera. And so Mary Kate can attest at that point in time, it was literally just a point and shoot camera, nothing fancy. But you know, in Galapagos, you can pretty much close your eyes and spin in a circle and get beautiful pictures no matter where you look. So with some of the images, I actually submitted into a few local photo competitions and actually won some awards from them, which was surprising. But you know, I'd already, growing up, I had an interest in photography and filmmaking and things like that that I never really pursued professionally. But looking at a lot of these field projects, I began to realize that there was a definite need for talking about these conservation projects to a larger audience and getting them to care about it in a way that was relatable and interesting as well. You know, scientists they're busy people, and sometimes their focus justifiably is on getting the science correct, not necessarily communicating that to the public. So with wildlife conservation projects and things like that, I decided to kind of shift gears, and I started to travel a little bit internationally working on some things, going everywhere from the Amazon in Peru to snorkeling in Iceland and photographing orca and things like that. So I even went from Belize snorkeling and photographing manatee for an NGO down there, to New Zealand photographing tuatara, which are a really, really cool species of reptile that look like lizards, but they're unrelated to any other reptile out there that's alive right now. They're their own separate thing. You got lizards, snakes, turtles and tortoises, and tuatara, their own separate thing. So I photographed these guys for a magazine, a reptiles magazine in the United States. And then I primarily work a lot with conservation projects, believe it or not, which more often than not, they include wildlife. And so I went to West Africa, working in Togo and Ghana to illustrate a lot of the pangolin issues that are going on right now. Pangolins are kind of like scaled anteaters. They're not exactly related in that way, but they eat a lot of termites and things like that. And they're the most poached mammal in the world today. And more recently, I was in Bangladesh for a while, filming some elephants with their mahouts that are captive elephants. They're not wild ones. And then also some wildlife like langurs and different monkey species and things like that. So I travel a lot internationally, needless to say. And so there's a lot of really cool images that I get that are just, you know, generic wildlife images, which I'm very proud of. But at the same time, my emphasis is largely on conservation projects, and that has a lot to do with people as well and how they interact with wildlife. And so my specialty is a little bit of a hybrid. I still do straightforward wildlife photography and things like that, but I also incorporate people a lot as well. So you'll see that mixed in with some of the later projects that I show you coming up. Things like, you know, traditional things like this hummingbird in Ecuador that I filmed last year. But so I'm going to pivot a little bit to the reality of working in the field. So it's very glamorous seeing all these very, very pretty pictures of animals that look to be in these picturesque landscapes and things like that. But the reality is a little bit different than that sometimes. You know, it is very enjoyable, but I honestly have no one but myself to blame for putting myself in some of these situations where it's a little less than glamorous. So I wanted to give you a little bit of behind the scenes insight into what some of the travel and wildlife photography entails. So this is what I look like about 90% of my time when I'm out in the field. I'm usually up to my waist in some kind of swampy water, or I am laying on my back in not very glamorous poses. It's not, looking at the other side of the camera is very comical at times because wildlife photographers have to put themselves in very compromising poses, and most of us make weird faces and things like that along the way. So you have to be open to just putting yourself in weird situations and being a little uncomfortable at times. And if you have a spouse, they're probably going to be very annoyed and bored with you when you go out on trips together. So my wife is a trooper, and she is very supportive of what I do. But whenever we go on vacation, sometimes I have to leave the camera behind because I need to spend time with her occasionally too, not just photographing things, because I can have my nose down into a camera for hours at a time and not realize. There's a lot of flat tires in the middle of the jungle, and you got to wait to try and figure things out that way. This one was in Belize, right off the Hummingbird Highway going through the jungle. And then this right here is a video that I wanted to show you, and I'll see if you guys can figure it out what it is before I tell you at the end. I'll give you a hint, it's in Bangladesh. So if any of you guys guessed that was a land leech, then you would be correct, because there's leeches all over the jungles throughout a lot of Southeast Asia and places like that. So I thought I would be extremely smart and, you know, throw any kind of fashion sense out the window and hike up my socks and tuck my pants down into them like you do ticks around here, which works most of the time. And that really isn't the case. Leeches, apparently, I figured out the hard way, they can, you know, burrow down through all your clothes and stuff. And so you get like nice blood spots that just keep on going. So it's not a very glamorous life doing a lot of this kind of wildlife photography. It's extremely rewarding, but there is a lot of hard work that goes into it. So I try to do a lot back here in Nebraska, specifically because there's no TSA and fewer exotic diseases. I've had my fair share of visits to the infectious disease unit out here in Omaha at the Med Center. But I also like to focus on Nebraska because it's my community right now, right? I really enjoy going out and doing international wildlife photography projects. But I think those in the long run are a little less impactful than working on projects here in my community at home, specifically with wildlife that I can work on for years at a time, right? So if I go travel to Ecuador for 2 weeks, I only have 2 weeks to try and capture a very nuanced subject, as compared to here, to where I can take years and years working and perfecting a lot of my not only technical issues, but also the narratives that come along with it. And just wildlife photography, a lot of the time, is just hitting the perfect moment. And if you don't have a whole lot of time because you're out of the country, that's not going to happen as much as it would back at home. So one of my main projects that I've been working on here in Nebraska and throughout the Midwest in general is a project called Floodplain. And the tagline is a clear view of life in the Big Muddy. And the reason I titled it that is because it's all about the Missouri River, which is also called the Big Muddy. And I'll give you a little bit of background into the project, and then I'll talk a little bit about why I chose to use this as an example for today's presentation. So we traveled the entire length of the Missouri River to kind of get an idea of what it looked like, from the source waters all the way down to the confluence in St. Louis, Missouri, where it meets up with the Mississippi River. And so we got a lot of really cool images from the air, definitely got some really cool winding aerials, some good landscape shots and things like that. But I felt there was so much going on underneath the surface of the water that I wasn't able to capture. So I've been trying for years to get some good underwater photography here in Nebraska, which, if you've ever seen Nebraska water, is not something that actually is very feasible in a lot of circumstances, right? This is one of the clearer shots that I've been able to get, and that was actually in a wetland right after it rained. So there was some relatively clear water, and to give you an idea of what you're seeing right here, that poor unfortunate toad in the middle is a female, and she's being bombarded with males who are trying to mate with her. So toads can basically get very competitive with their mating procedures. And so I wanted to do something that was a split level underwater. And I captured it well enough, but I was never really happy with how a lot of my underwater photography turned out in Nebraska. I got pretty industrious. I would snorkel through, if anyone has been to the Schramm State Recreation Area, the aquarium there. If you've ever been to the trout ponds, I tried swimming through those, which I figured out after the fact are spring fed and extremely cold. And I have yet to wisen up and invest in a wetsuit. So I also decided, okay, that's a little cold and I'm not getting good stuff out there. How about we take it to the next level and jump inside of the aquariums? This was before the remodel, and they were very generous and let me do so. And I got some okay images, but once again, they never really captured the true nature of what I was trying to get regarding the biodiversity of the Missouri River. It's a very technically difficult thing to photograph. And so I kind of went off and did a few different things. I was, at this point in time, I was an educator at Fontenelle Forest out in Bellevue, Nebraska. And I used to take a lot of students out seine netting, which is you take this big long net, and my wife got suckered into helping me with this one. And so we would go out into this wetland and we would drag this net along and then pull it up and see what was in there. And a lot of this was for scientific and educational purposes, all done with permits and things like that. And so after doing this a lot of the time, though, I started to realize there's a whole lot of cool fish just right here in this one wetland that I go to almost every day. And so I figured, okay, well, maybe we can ethically and safely, since we're already netting these things for research purposes, maybe I can bring an aquarium out there and bring it on site to where I don't have to transport them. They're not stuck in a bag or a tote or anything like that for long periods of time. And so I started to capture some really good, what the photography technique is called high key photography. And so it's a solid white backdrop. And if you've ever heard of the Meet Your Neighbors project, I would highly recommend that you check it out. And it gives you an idea of what the animal looks like isolated from that background. And so it really draws your eyes and your attention to these animals on an eye-to-eye level. And so a lot of you may be familiar with Joel Sartori's work, this with his photo arc. This is very similar. It's a little bit of a different technical process, lighting it from behind as compared to where Joel lights it from the front only. He doesn't do the back illumination. And so it's a very interesting process, and it comes with some very stellar results for educational purposes as well, not only from wildlife imagery, but also from conservation standpoints and education. These right here are paddlefish eggs. And that last image that I just showed you, the paddlefish, you can actually see down inside of the mouth, those are gill rakers, which are basically these little combs on their gills. And that's how they eat. They're basically like whale sharks of the Midwest. So they open their big mouth and then they kind of swim around in this murky water. And then all of these plankton get stuck to those gill rakers. And that's how they actually feed. They don't eat big things, even though they can get upwards of 6 feet long. They're gigantic freshwater fish here in Nebraska and throughout the Midwest and the Missouri River. But they also use those gigantic paddles on their nose. It's called their rostrum. And there's a whole bunch of receptors up in there that pick up electrical impulses. And so that's how they've adapted to hunt their prey or force filter feed in the murky waters of the Missouri River. So this photographic technique opened up a whole lot of doors for me to tell these stories about things like endangered pallid sturgeon. These are an endangered species that is being managed by the Army Corps of Engineers and a whole bunch of different federal and state wildlife agencies. And so I could go and partner with these aquariums, things like Gavin's Point National Fish Hatchery, to where bringing ethics back into the equation, I'm not going out there and capturing endangered species. To me, that would not be an acceptable use of, or an acceptable purpose for capturing these things. Scientific reasons aside and all that, I don't think it would be ethical for me to go out and do that. So I work with a lot of these collaborative organizations like Gavin's Point National Fish Hatchery, the Schramm Education Center, and things like that, to where I can get a lot of these images of animals that are already in these captive situations, to where I'm not going out and collecting a lot of animals, bringing them back home, and then photographing them there. And so I think it was a really good compromise. And I think I've been getting some pretty decent images. And this has been a very successful multi-year project that I'm still working on. As a matter of fact, I've got some fun individuals that I should be photographing out at Nebraska Wildlife Rehab soon, which is where this image was taken of a breed. And there may or may not be an otter and a beaver and a mink involved with some of this split level photography. I really wanted to use this photographic technique where there was the water line to really illustrate the fact that the Missouri River's ecology takes place both under and above water, and sometimes it doesn't differentiate one or the other. Things like otters will go out of the water and then back into it. And so the river banks and outside of that, even with things like birds, is all connected with the Missouri River. Even things like, bald eagles. They are primarily pescatarian or piscivores, sorry, to where they primarily eat fish and things like that come from the river. So it's all interconnected at a very intricate level. Obviously, beavers are, the architects of the wetlands. They essentially dam up a lot of these streams and create these gigantic wetlands that are all associated with the Missouri River as well. And so even things like bats, this is a northern long-eared bat. And people sometimes ask me why is a bat associated with the river? Well, this bat specifically has a migratory corridor that follows along the Missouri River, and we don't know much about it. So there's a lot of research being done to illustrate how even these threatened bats are very closely linked to that Missouri River ecosystem. And so this kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of what the behind the scenes look like. This is at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, Dennis Ferraro's herp lab. He generously allowed me to go and photograph some of his animals, like this water snake. It's a Nerodia species. And so this is what most of the behind the scenes look like. But for every image that I get that looks like this, polished image, there's about 50 to 100 that look like this. Just there's quite a few that don't make the cut. And so with wildlife photography, you have to be used to the fact that not every photo you take is going to be a keeper. There's going to be a lot of misses involved. And so you just have to be patient, especially with things like mink that apparently can levitate. I didn't realize this mink was bouncing all over the inside of this little enclosure at Nebraska Wildlife Rehab. And so he was very excited. He was munching on some food along the way. He was not stressed at all. He was just very excited and jumping all over the place and pooping all over the white background that I had set up. So there's a lot of problem solving that comes with wildlife photography along the way. And I know that a lot of you may be thinking that this isn't traditional wildlife photography. I'm not out in the field, in situ as they call it, photographing a lot of animals. And so I do that a lot of the time as well. I just wanted to focus on this project because I think it rides that line with ethics and things like that. And it talks about collaborating with other partners in order to get those shots in a way that isn't hurting wild populations. And I'm not the one who's making the judgment calls in that situation. This exhibit has since gone on to become a gallery that's traveled all around the state to different educational centers and things like that. There have been some informational children's groups that come through, school groups that come through, and we have these different, I guess you can say they fill out these little sheets that ask them questions, almost like a scavenger hunt, to where they can learn about these animals. Because, the images are maybe very appealing for adults, but for children, I wanted to get them involved as well. And if any of you have ever wondered what 50 pounds of, or more like 75 pounds of stickers looks like, that right there is 75 pounds worth of stickers that have these images on them. Because last year, or I should say 2 years ago, I installed 50 of these sidewalk decals, which are essentially gigantic stickers that stay on the concrete for 2 to 3 months at a time. And each one of these had a different species in the Missouri River on it with some educational facts and things like that. And so this was plastered all along the Bob Carey pedestrian bridge. I did get permission from the city of Omaha and the city of Council Bluffs to do so. And so people could walk all along the riverfront, along the pedestrian bridge, and then down along the Council Bluffs side as well. And they could learn about the animals living in or around that river as they're seeing the river right then and there. And so that to me was, I think, a very interesting application, and the way I wanted to progress with the way I used a lot of my wildlife photography to impact change for positive reasons. And now I'm in the process of finalizing a project with the National Park Service to install these at 20 or 30 nature centers all along the Missouri River. It doesn't, depending on whatever state wants them at that point in time. And so I'm going to get into a little bit more of the nitty gritty tips and tricks now that you've kind of seen some of my work. So there may be some behind the scenes stuff. I may show some videos showing the processes or the final results. So please bear with me and just kind of sit back and enjoy it. Mary Kate, do you have any questions so far that are relevant that we should discuss?
Pardon. We did have a couple of questions come in.
Yeah.
Catherine would like to know how you spell tuatara, which was the lizard-like animal that you were talking about.
Yeah, that is Tuatara, tuatara. I would do a deep dive down the rabbit hole on Wikipedia or something. They're really cool animals. They're probably my favorite animals.
And we did also have a question from Sophia. She wants to know, when you were traveling internationally, what kind of job enabled you to do that?
At that point in time, it was kind of a hybrid job. When I first started traveling internationally, I started when I was still a zookeeper. And I actually would have to take vacation time to do that. And so I wasn't able to do so very often. Then gradually, when I started to do more and more freelance work in multimedia, so I would work with a lot of other organizations and things like that, I can pick and choose my schedule. I still had to work part-time at other places though. I was the animal care specialist out at Fontenelle Forest for a while. And then I went down to part-time educator there. So that way I had more time to actually go and pursue a lot of these projects that I wanted. And so it hasn't been easy financially, but I'm at a place right now to where it's actually sustainable and I can work a lot of the time specifically in what I want to be doing. And so it took quite a few years to get to that point. It's not something that you can do necessarily overnight unless you have some very generous benefactors and are lucky in that regard. If that's the case, more power to you, pursue it, get on that. And but otherwise you have to kind of, in my instance specifically, I had to take it kind of day by day. And my wife does work full time, which helps a little bit of the time. But yeah, it was just about a 3 or 4 year effort of a transition, getting to the point to where I was getting enough clients. I hate using that word. It sounds so sterile and business-like, but the reality of the matter is that I get paid doing this stuff sometimes. And I do have to work on projects sometimes that aren't wildlife-based. I work with a lot of other nonprofits locally that help pay the bills, and I get some really, really cool work that's still, I think, applicable, things in the conservation field or things in the public interest field. And so, yeah, you just kind of have to pull any strings that you can and pull all your resources together in order to be able to do this stuff. And I'm not out of the country, like 3/4 of the year or anything like that. I do spend quite a bit of time here, but I will spend, I'll leave the country, COVID aside. This past year is not the example of my normal schedule. But normally I would leave the country 3 or 4 times a year to work on these projects.
All right. And then speaking of projects, Vicky asked if you finished the Sandhill Crane project you were working on last March of 2020.
I do have some footage for that, and I did that under the I did that for Nebraska Game and Parks. And so at this point, I'm not putting together a personal story or video based off of that stuff, but all of that footage will go back into Nebraska Game and Parks stock footage that will be used for things in the future. Last year, I did put together an actual polished edited video from the Sandhill cranes. And so if you wanted to check that out, it should be on Nebraska Game and Parks website, as well as on my social media accounts. I think it might be on my Facebook page, Alex Wiles Media. Cool. You want to keep going on with this and we'll answer some more questions at the end?
Sounds good. It looks
All
like
right,
we're good.
So this is what I'm going to call tips and tricks to ethically get the shot, but I'm also going to call it, what would MacGyver do? Because once again, as with getting into the field of wildlife photography and filmmaking, as with gear and getting the shot, there's no one best way to do it. There's a lot of things that you have to consider along the way. There's a lot of new emerging technologies that you have to consider along the way as well. But I'll try and run you through some of the situations that I've encountered that have required creative solutions in order to get the shots in a way that I deemed ethical and that I was comfortable with. You know, I take very seriously not harassing wildlife, not harming wildlife. I'm a member of an organization called the International League of Conservation Photographers. And if any of you are interested in getting into this field, I highly recommend you look them up online. And they have a very strict code of ethics that, you know, we try to all adhere to, and we try to kind of always be state of the art with how we consider ethics in wildlife photography. And so the first thing you can do to be an ethical wildlife photographer is get a big old lens. You know, birds don't stand a chance with this kind of lens. You know, you can stay far away. You don't even have to get close to them or freak them out. Now, these can get expensive, so it may not be an option for everyone, but it is a surefire way of getting some decent shots. There's still a lot of technical stuff that goes into it. Don't get me wrong, but this is a great first step for maintaining ethical distances and things like that. This is, for those of you who are already into photography, this is a 150 to 600 millimeter Sigma lens. And so it's on a camera. This is a red cinema camera, but it's the equivalent of an APS-C or crop sensor camera. So it ends up being more like 900 millimeters when it's all said and done. So it's got some reach on it, right? And so another thing you can do is you can build blinds. And so I built this blind, well, more specifically, Ethan Fries, who's on Platte Basin Time Lapse, he asked me to, or he invited me to go out and help him build this blind. And so blinds are a great way of sitting down and waiting for a subject to come to you, or if you know there's something interesting like a prairie chicken lek or something like that, you can set it off in a distance a little bit, and you can literally camp in there for the entire day or multiple days if you're that into it. And so basically you're not distracting them with moving around and all of that. It's essentially a glorified tent. You can buy commercially produced photography blinds as well. Some people prefer to build them just because they can customize it to that specific landscape. But this is a great way of, you know, getting yourself close and in proximity to a subject and getting them used to your presence to where you're not interrupting any of their natural behaviors. And you still have to be careful not get too close with blinds, because just because you're blind, you know, animals can be intelligent and they can be very perceptive. So if you're too close, it doesn't matter if you're blind or not, they can still hear you and see you sometimes. So you have to judge that distance. And the best thing to do is you do both. So specifically speaking of the sandhill crane project that I was working on, this is a picture that I took of that situation. A lot of places like the Crane Trust, where I specifically went to work with here, Rose Sanctuary, the Nature Conservancy, all these different places, they have permanent blinds for big things like the crane migration that they know is going to happen every year. This is a perfect opportunity for someone who may not have as many physical capabilities to get out and build their own stuff. A lot of these are easier to access. They're permanently installed, so they've got bigger doors, things like that. Some of them, if you're really, really fancy, even have heat or are fully enclosed where you don't have to freeze your butt off. But this is a great first step for those of you interested in getting good crane pictures. I know there's places like the prairie chicken leks every spring. There's different blinds you can find for that kind of stuff. And so it's a great option. So if you can combine that with a long lens, that's a great way to get some great behavioral images and video without stressing out the animals, because ultimately the behavior of the animal, if you impact it, you're not going to get as good results. You want to get those natural behaviors. And so it's in your interest as well as the animal's interest to not distract them and to not startle them. So another thing that is a really good option is to let the birds or the animals come to you. This was a setup out in Ecuador to where they had a hummingbird feeder that was just filled with basic, you know, hummingbird nectar, sugar water solution, however they mixed it up. And in Ecuador, it's a hotbed. You know, obviously it's the tropics, there's hummingbirds everywhere, there's tons of species of them. And so you didn't have to do much because they were already here. It's actually a video, I'll play it. They are completely calm around it because they know that that feeder is there and that they're going to be safe and they're not going to be predated there. And so if you're, I mean, if you stand still, they'll even like perch on your finger there. So they are very accustomed to having people around there. But I will say bird feeders are kind of the exception for most instances of what photographers don't, or ethical photographers refer to as baiting. So what is not acceptable in most instances is using bait to lure an animal in. So a lot of situations where this has come up recently is things like people using mice to lure in an owl to get the shot, right? That's not acceptable because those animals at that point in time, specifically predators and things like that, will become dependent and they'll start to revisit these locations over and over and over again. Bird feeders have been kind of on that cusp. You know, sometimes people ask, well, are bird feeders different? And there has been some research that has been done that shows that bird feeders don't have a negative impact on the behavior of most bird species. But things like baiting carnivores and predators will, because it'll lure predators into areas that are more commonly frequented by people. And that's not a good situation to be in because a lot of predators then will be shot and killed or things like that. So there's a lot of negative connotation for baiting, but bird feeders is generally considered acceptable. And so using this setup right here, just sitting at this one bird feeder with a regular lens, didn't have to get extremely long. I was still back a little bit further, but you can tell obviously that they were very comfortable with my presence. I was able to get some interesting footage for this NGO out in Ecuador called Hocotoco. So if you wanted to watch it, let me know after the video if it turns out all right with the quality streaming it. And so that right there is the letting them come to you method, right? You get a lot of natural behaviors from these birds. They were competing with each other. There was some breeding, displays and things like that in there. And you always get the best results if you let the animal come to you. If you start chasing animals down that are definitely not comfortable with it, you get a whole lot of butt pictures, which normally isn't the best image that you're looking for, right? You want them to get used to you and come towards you. So if you can set up a blind or someplace like that feeder that you know that they're going to come back to and just wait and be patient, then you allow them to come closer to you on their terms. And that's going to be the best results that you can get. And it's the most ethical as well, because then you're not stressing them out and harassing them. Oh, you're not going to let me go? Okay. So then getting a little bit more into the technical side of things, we have camera traps. This is a great way to get very up close and personal with animals and not stress them out. Camera traps are essentially, if you've ever seen those trail cams that like hunters and stuff use, that are the boxes that they strap to a tree, and there's a trigger, an infrared trigger to where when an animal walks past, it's a motion sensor and it takes a picture. Well, you can adapt these things to actually house DSLR cameras and high quality cameras, right? And they're all contained battery wise and all that stuff. And you can set them out there and leave them, depending on your battery, for days or weeks at a time, right? Some people leave them out there for years. Plat Basin Time Lapse does this a lot of the time for their time lapse stuff, and they leave them out there for years with solar generators. And so the results from this is you're not out there in the field, but you can compose the exact shot that you want and wait for an animal just to walk by, and that's it. And so you get images on the back of it, like this deer family. There's a couple little fawns right here. This is out in a nature preserve out near Fort Calhoun. You get these really stellar shots of natural behaviors and animals acting like they normally would, because there's nobody there to startle them to take a picture. And a lot of mirrorless cameras nowadays, the brand new cameras, You can even do silent shutter modes to where they won't even hear a click of the shutter going off. And so this is a great way to utilize technology to get some better shots. And you can even get some cool things. This was at that same nature preserve. You can get some really cool, he was just, I think he just took a bath and was kind of rinsing his wings off. And so a lot of things that I don't think I would have ever been able to get this wide angle shot up close if I was physically there, because that bird would have just never gotten that close to me, right? And so another thing, delving into the technology rabbit hole, you can use a lot of really cool things. This may be out of most people's budgets to do a lot of these things, but you can do a lot of remote control operations as well. Like this right here is a gimbal with a camera attached to the end of it that I can remote control with a video game controller. And so it's just your standard PlayStation controller, and you can program it to wirelessly connect with this gimbal. So you could set it up from a distance, and you can even pan and zoom and get video that way as well. So there's a lot of cool technology or technological applications. Sorry, my cat decided to start meowing at me. And here's something that I did recently with a bison project out at the Crane Trust that has a nice genetically pure bison herd. And they had just calved. So I didn't want to startle them, and I didn't want to get down close to them. And obviously, I think most people should know that it's not a good idea to get really close to a bison, right? That's not only bad for the wildlife, but probably pretty stupid on the person's side as well, right? So I tried to find a way of getting better images that way. And my good friend, Pete Carbonell, he got some behind the scenes footage that I wanted to show you. So we're at the Crane Trust right now, out in Grand Island, Nebraska. And they generously let us come out and film their bison herd today. And so we've been trying to use some new methods of filming the bison that we haven't done in the past, including the normal telephoto photography using a really, really long lens, which is what a lot of people do. But instead, we've been trying to use an 18-foot jib, which is basically a crane made for cameras. And so we put a gimbal on the end of it and put it in the back of a truck so we can go right out into the middle of the herd, and we can try and get unique angles that are a little different than this. This right here is the typical scenery that you would find with people filming bison, because they have to use a really long lens, because you obviously don't want to get close to bison, right? But we're trying to find a way of getting close to bison without startling and scaring them, and to where we can get these really cool moving dynamic shots using this 18-foot camera crane. And so to give you an idea of what that looks like, the final result, I'm going to play a video for you next. And just to let you guys know too, the driver for that was the main biologist for those bison out there. So I always try to work with all of the biologists and the specialists who are familiar with that stuff. So that way I'm not the one making judgment calls on the safety and security of those animals. And he said that they were perfectly fine with this whole setup. So here's the video that was the end result from that. And there are some drone shots in here as well too. And I'll talk a little bit about that if we have time. Kind of running out. All right. And so I'm going to breeze through this because I want to allow some time for Q&A as well. Like I said earlier, I always try to work with specialists in the field because even though I have a biology background and I was a zookeeper for a long time, I'm always going to be distracted with the camera, right? With the settings, making sure I get the shot. And so if I'm ever in a situation with like those bison or things at wildlife rehab, I always want someone to be able to tell me, hey, okay, now's the time to stop because we don't want that animal to get stressed. And so whenever you can do that when you're working with other people, that's an amazing resource to have because then it's keeping you accountable and you're making sure that you're adhering to any kind of legal standards as well as ethical standards that they have in place because they're going to know those animals a heck of a lot better than you will in those circumstances, right? And so this is, I think, is going to be the last video I'll show you, but the perfect example of someone doing that is Joel Sartori, right? And so I worked with him recently on a project for National Geographic where we went around to different zoos that have animals that are already under human care. And so he's done an amazing job of communicating with researchers and zookeepers and things like that. And so we actually had this, it is for an advertising thing. I'm not getting sponsored, so I'm not trying to sell you guys anything. But Eddie Redmayne, the actor who played Newt Scamander in Fantastic Beasts and all that, narrated all of our footage and all that too. So this is the most recent project that I've worked on for commercial purposes.
What do you see? This rainbow of fur, feathers, and scales. This spectrum of life. A billion colors living and breathing around us. Making our world more beautiful with every step, leap, and flight. But some of these colors are so rare, so unique, that they might be gone forever. Left only to our memories and imaginations. These are endangered colors, some the very last of their kind. But we can help. We can do more, and they can live on for today, tomorrow, and beyond. Because these animals and these colors shouldn't just live on your phone. They should live on forever.
So, yeah, to sum it up, I like working collaboratively with a lot of researchers. I just did a bee research thing to where we filmed bees in high speed. And if you build it, they will come. We built a nice a log that was set up specifically to allow these bumblebees to nest. And we put it out next to a bumblebee colony. And a few months later, they had colonized it. And so we had the perfect opportunity to ethically film these things and not have to worry about tearing apart logs to get down in there and film things and all that. We had set it up specifically how we wanted it and let them come to it and set it up on their own terms. So with that being said, I wanted to maintain a little bit of time. I think we got 10 minutes or so for questions and things like that. So feel free to chime in. And if you wanted to check out any more of my stuff, I do have my information right down there from my website and my social media. But yeah, feel free to lay in with any questions you may have. Sorry, I had to rush the end there.
All right, we do have a couple of questions waiting already. So one from Catherine is, do you have any tips on stabilizing a handheld in the field?
Stabilizing handheld in the field. If you're using a really long lens, one of the best things, if you don't want to carry a big tripod around, because that's always the best option, is a gigantic tripod that's heavy, right? But that's not always the case. And so a monopod is actually a really great option as well. I've traveled extensively to like Ecuador and hiking up hills and mountains for like 3-4 hours straight in the rain and the mud. And the last thing you want to carry is a gigantic heavy tripod. And so having a monopod, which is just a single pole on the end, gives you a lot of flexibility with how you can compose shots and things like that. But it also gives you a lighter load to carry. So that's a great way of doing it. If you really want super stabilized footage for things like video and all that, a gimbal is a great way of doing that. Depending on the size of your camera, there's a whole bunch of different models of gimbals out there from companies like DJI. I think it's pronounced Zune is another one. And so there's a lot of those for video applications as well. I wouldn't use them as much for stills. I would use more of a monopod or tripod for those situations, or even something like a sandbag. If you're photographing from the window of your car, something like bison, or if you're out on a safari or something like that, sandbags that you can fill with rice or something there. You don't have to carry these big heavy things internationally or travel with them. You can fill them with rice, set them on the car, and boom, stabilized.
Alrighty. Another one is someone had heard conflicting opinions on using recorded bird song to lure birds. What are your opinions on that?
I tend to not do it because it does tend to, I feel I've seen some instances where it confuses birds, you know, some like with barred owls is a big one that I've seen recently. You know, barred owls are very easily lured in with auditory noises and things like that. And I don't think it hurts them outright. I'm not going to go out, and that's not going to be my hill to die on from an ethics perspective. There's people who know a lot more about that specific subject than I do. But I still don't practice it just because I've seen it impact a lot of birds and things like that. So I'm sure it's a very subjective topic. I'm sure there's some birds that tolerate it much better than others. But yeah, so I'm not an authority on that specific subject, so I can't tell you one way or another. I would just say that I tend to not use it when I'm out photographing and filming things.
All right. And Brianna would like to know, what's your favorite camera to use in the field?
That's a difficult one. I'm kind of a gearhead. I've got a lot of different cameras for work, or you know, I work for Nebraska Game and Parks as well, and so I've got some work cameras and my personal freelance cameras that I use. My current favorite one that I've been using and that I own right now is called a Panasonic S1H. It's a DSLR camera, or it's a mirrorless, sorry. And so it's great for both stills and video. Most of my work recently has been video work, but I still love to shoot still photography and wildlife images. And so this is kind of the best of both worlds. When I travel internationally, I don't have to carry a gigantic cinema camera because as much as I love the images that come from cinema cameras, they are gigantic and they require a whole bunch of accessories to carry and to assemble along the way. This one is very much a one-stop shop and easy to, I may actually have it. Give me just a second. Here's one of them right here. So you can see it's not much. It's just like a regular DSLR camera, right? It's mirrorless, but it shoots up to 6K video as well as 24 megapixel stills. It's got an amazing viewfinder, things like that. So I'm not sponsored or anything. It's just my current favorite camera to use. But I'm always looking for new things as well. There's always new cameras coming out.
Alrighty.
Cool.
Do we have
questions?
any other questions?
Sorry, I
All
kind of
right.
talked really fast there, guys. If you don't have questions, I completely understand it. I kind of rambled there.
Well, Naomi does say thank you. They learned so much from this, so you're welcome. We appreciate having you here. If there are no more questions, thank you. Oh, we do have another questions. Can insects see the light that is used for autofocus?
Ooh, the autofocus assist light. You know, I'm sure some insects probably could see it. Most of those are kind of an amber coloration. So, or at least the ones on my current camera are kind of an amber color to where it shouldn't be too much in their spectrum. But I would talk to an entomologist about that more specifically. I tend to not use those as much because whenever I'm shooting insects like this one right here, you know, the grasshopper, I tend to use manual focus for a lot of that because I'm shooting wide angle macro. But I honestly don't think that insects would be extremely perturbed by that, especially if it's during the day. During the night, it may be an issue a little bit more, but at that point, you're probably going to have some supplemental light as well to focus because that little autofocus light isn't going to be doing too much for you. But I've anecdotally never seen any issues with using a focus light with insects, but that is a very good question.
All right. And we have an anonymous attendee asking if you can tell us about shooting nocturnal animals.
Yeah, nocturnal animals is actually a really great question. I have a friend, an Australian friend, who's an amazing wildlife photographer named Doug Gimshie. And he's actually recently been doing a lot of research on this kind of stuff. And he's noticed that some nocturnal animals are very impacted by things like flash photography and things like that. So a lot of it is dependent on the specific species. Some animals are a lot more susceptible to light pollution and to getting blinded temporarily, especially if it's like a flighted animal that may crash into something if they are temporarily blinded. If it's something like a slow moving animal that is kind of nested up for the night or something, I doubt it would be too impacted visually, but then at that point you have to worry about disturbing an animal that's bedded down for the night, right? And so I think that's, as with everything with wildlife photography, a little subjective. And I think if you're planning on going out and photographing something nocturnal, I would see if you can find any resources online that specifically address that animal or that species. And if not, maybe there's a biologist that you can ask those questions as well too, because I've noticed most biologists are extremely open to working collaboratively with photographers because, I mean, they get really good images of the things that they love and that they work with every day. So nocturnal animals, I will say that I have used flash with a lot of nocturnal animals, but I would never use it in the field with things like an owl that's about to fly away and things like that. Most of the time it's things like it's a little insect or it's a little frog or something that I know isn't going to crash into a tree afterwards. But there's a lot of ongoing research that may change things up in the near future. I don't know.
Oh, all right. We have another anonymous question. What popular methods of capturing photos do you not agree with or find unethical?
Um, I'll preface this by saying I love using drones. I use drones for a lot of my work. I have a friend who's a drone operator that I contract all the time, who's a licensed commercial drone operator, and you get some stellar images out of this. But unfortunately, as with most things in life, there's a few people that kind of ruin it for everyone, right? Recently, there's been a situation to where I think it was, what species of bird was it? I don't remember what it was,
It was
but
a
there was a
species.
big nesting colony of some kind of shorebird. And a drone operator flew right over it to take pictures of it and crashed it in the middle of the nesting colony. And all of the adults left. And all of those, and they're an endangered species, all of those birds never came back to incubate their eggs. And so basically that entire colony of endangered animals was no longer viable, or at least for this generation, right? And so I've also seen people using first person perspective drones, the FPV drones, chasing monkeys around with them and things like that. I'm not really big on that. I think that it may be difficult to get permission to fly drones in some areas, and most of the cases are justified. So I think we need, as conscientious photographers and filmmakers, we need to adhere by those rules and not break them, right? So whenever I do something for a bigger project, I always hire a commercially licensed pilot, so that way I'm adhering to all the laws. I always ask permission from the landowners, depending on where I'm at. You always got to make sure that you have input from someone, like with the bison drone operation, right? I specifically asked them if it was appropriate, and they said yes, just don't fly directly over. So we maintained our distance, and they were watching every step of the way, and the bison didn't care at all. You know, a lot of situations that is applicable, but there's other situations to where I've just been like, no, I'm not going to do it. Even though it would be an amazing shot, I'm not going to do it because there's too much of a risk.
All righty. Um, give people a few seconds to see if anyone has any other questions. I believe the species of bird you were was a type of tern, because I remember seeing
It was a
the
tern, yes.
that.
Yeah, it was some kind of endangered tern. I don't know specifically which one it was, but it's unfortunate because that probably means that that one person doing something irresponsible may lead to more regulations for people who are doing things the right way. And that's, you know, we have to set a good example and set a good precedent for people to prove that we're in it for the right reasons, right?
Absolutely. Alrighty. Well, if no one has any more questions, thank you all for coming. When the webinar closes out, there will be a poll on your screen. We would greatly appreciate it if you would take a couple of seconds to fill that out. Your input really does help us with bettering our webinars. And Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and go over this with us. We really appreciate it. I think you did an amazing job. We have a lot of people commenting in the chat saying you did an amazing job and that they learned quite a bit as well.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I appreciate it. And feel free to reach out to me via my website or social media too, if you guys have any other further questions.
All right. Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.